You've been very patient, Minister. And now, at last, I call the next item of business, the debate on motion 22004 in the name of Christina McKelvey on showing solidarity with anti-racism. I invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now. And I call on the Minister to speak to and move the motion. Minister, 13 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Let me start with three vital words that everyone needs to hear and we all need to understand. Black lives matter. All across the world, people are standing up and making that point. Cross-party consensus on this point is vital, and we will be supporting the amendments brought forward by the Labour Party and the Green Party to the Government's motion today. I know that all of us across this chamber have been shocked and appalled by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis on the 25th of May. His terrible, senseless death is a tragedy that has reopened the seismic fault lines that exist within US society, where for too long black people have continued to suffer the most appalling inequality, prejudice and discrimination. Large parts of America are standing up and saying, "Not in my name," and enough is enough. Now, Presiding Officer, I know it is absolutely understandable that people should wish to make their voice heard. At the weekend, we saw protests across Scottish cities, which included many thousands of people coming together to show their anger and solidarity. However, the First Minister was very clear, and I want to make it very clear today, and we continue to be clear, that we strongly oppose and discourage mass gatherings, and that people seeking to make their voice heard find alternative means to do so. We are at a critical point in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and the hard-won gains we have seen in terms of the infection rate reducing should not be lost. The many of us who wish to make clear our strong solidarity with the black community should do so virtually or through supporting the charities working on the ground to improve the lives of black and minority ethnic people both in Scotland and further afield. I would encourage everyone to act responsibly, whilst continuing, of course, to make their voice heard. COVID is still with us and people are still dying, and the priority must be protecting our public health. Presiding Officer, I now want to turn to the inequality that black and other ethnic minority communities in Scotland continue to experience. When I undertook a tour of Glasgow last year, not for the first time, but to learn more about the cities linked to the historic slave trade, I was struck by just how much that terrible stain upon our history is still woven throughout the fabric of that great city. Whilst today we are resolutely focused on improving the lives of black and minority ethnic people, we cannot forget that we once enabled the terrible practice of slavery. It is clear to me that roots of the entrenched structural racism that continues to pervade global society are firmly based in the historic enslavement of black people, mainly from African countries. Racism has allowed white people to determine black people as a subhuman class, treated as chattel, as property. By reducing black people to this status, it salved the collective conscience of white people over the world to justify their barbaric acts, and we should all take responsibility for that. We cannot gloss over our historic attitudes and our actions, nor can we assume that simply because we live in the modern era that everything is much better. Recent events have demonstrated that is clearly not the case, and we need to move forward in a way that reflects the reality of the historical oppression of black people and what we need to do to tackle injustice and build true equality. Patrick Harvey's amendment calls for the establishment of a slavery museum to address our historic links to the slave trade and expresses regret around the fact that so many monuments and street names still celebrate the perpetrators and profiteers of slavery. On the latter point, there are a range of views, as we know. Some think that such monuments and signs should be torn down immediately, whilst others believe it is important to reflect the reality of the past, and to do otherwise erases the experience and the reality of the terrible inequality and suffering that existed. Our view is that these matters are best considered in a respectful and reflective way that is grounded in the voices and lived experience of those most affected by the issues. I give Patrick Harvey my commitment today that we will play our part in contributing to that discussion. In relation to the suggestion of a museum, Patrick Harvey will be aware that the University of Glasgow is taking forward work in this area, and following a report published in 2019 by Dr Stephen Mullen, which made a number of recommendations in this area. My officials are currently following up on these recommendations directly with the university. But one key area of progress I would like to highlight is the establishment of the new James McEwan Smith Learning Hub, in recognition of the first African-American to be awarded a medical degree from the University of Glasgow in 1837. Another long-term goal is the establishment of a Hunterian exhibition on slavery, and we will continue to engage with the university as they take forward the work in this area. Presiding Officer, I now want to turn to the broader agenda. The Scottish Government has taken steps to advance race equality and tackle racism, but to be frank and absolutely honest, we have not gone far enough, and we need to make much greater progress. In 2017, we published a Race Equality Action Plan outlining actions we will take over the course of this Parliament to secure better outcomes for minority ethnic communities in Scotland. An update published last year indicated that while progress had been made in some areas, there remains so much more to do, and a senior-level programme board has been established to drive the progress we all want to see. In the last financial year, we allocated £2.6 million to fund organisations working to advance race equality. We have taken action to address bullying and discrimination in our schools, still a work in progress, and we have a working group to take forward measures to address underrepresentation of minority ethnic teachers in Scotland's schools. We are actively working to improve the employment rates of minority ethnic groups in Scotland, and our Workforce Equality Fund has funded initiatives to support minority ethnic people to progress within the workplace and employers to develop a more inclusive workforce. Presiding Officer, black and minority ethnic representation in this place is still severely lacking, and there remains a significant issue that we have never seen a woman of any ethnic minority background in this Scottish Parliament in its 20 years. So funding for the Equal Representation Coalition has supported them to develop a toolkit to help political parties to improve the diversity of their membership with a view to addressing the underrepresentation in not just this place but across other elected places in this country. Dr Emma Jackson and Louise MacDonald are also taking forward thinking through the First Minister's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls on how we build greater intersectionality into our approach on gender equality. I look forward to publishing the report of the final year of the current Race Equality Action Plan in 2021, which will include consideration of areas where further action and focus should be placed. I welcome further debate and scrutiny in this place on the progress we have made so far, and I'd encourage the colleagues across the chamber to join me in that.
We cannot disassociate racism and discrimination from the ingrained economic inequality embedded within capitalism, and until we address those economic issues, then the issues of gender, race and class inequality will remain within our society.
Minister.
Well, I mean, I suppose, yes, we could say that, but actually the endemic structural inequality that is faced by our minority ethnic communities now is based in that history, and we need to understand where that came from so that we can work out what we need to do to move forward. And that can only be done with more representation in this place, more representation in our public boards, more representation in our workplaces, and more representation at every level of our communities. The people are there. We just need to make sure we can encourage them to do that, and then we can change some of those structural inequalities.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I join with others in recognising the events that have prompted us to have this debate at this time, the extraordinary impact of the Black Lives Matter movement coming in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, an event which echoed police violence, brutality and racism down the ages. It took place in an extraordinary context of a public health crisis, but that context reminds us that when restrictions do need to be enforced for the public good, people need to know that the authorities, including government and police, are acting in their interests and respecting their human rights. This, sadly, is not the case in the United States. The systematic racist police brutality and the systematic racist voter suppression both long pre-existed the COVID crisis, but both have also been exacerbated by the current circumstances. So the Black Lives Matter movement, in all its expressions, is necessary, urgent, and demands our support. At the same time, we all have a responsibility to echo, as the Minister said, the critically important public health message. Nothing in my amendment is intended to encourage mass gatherings, and indeed I do not encourage mass gatherings. And I remind members that last week during FMQs, I said that I hope everybody considering joining a protest would act responsibly and observe social distancing, and that perhaps it would be better to do things from home, such as donating to community bail funds. And I say that again. Many of us who would like to see an end to the arms industry everywhere, and surely I hope we all want to see an end to state violence. Those might be long-term ideals, but as long as the arms industry exists, we must constantly ask ourselves how its products will be used and by whom. The US is clearly not a safe country to which we should be exporting tear gas, rubber bullets and riot gear. They are the weapons of oppression in a society where the police, which in some states was founded as slave catcher militia, are still displaying deep institutional racism. Those forces have also been increasingly militarised, and in some places in recent weeks have begun to behave in a paramilitary fashion, displaying no identification and subject to no accountability. In that context, the call to defund the police should be no way controversial compared with the defunding of education, the defunding of healthcare and the defunding of housing, which has been endured disproportionately by black communities. As for our own history, there's so much to reflect on. As we look at a government response to COVID, which has involved a fiscal intervention that's been described as unprecedented, and it will take time to count the full bill, 100 billion, could reach 200 billion, we should reflect on one aspect of the UK's slavery history that shocks most of us when we first learn it, that when the legal slave trade was finally done away with, the UK government borrowed money for compensation equivalent to 300 billion in today's terms, but it was compensation not to the victims of slavery, but to the perpetrators who had already profited from their brutality. Even the abolitionists thought that the slavers deserved a reward instead of a punishment for their crimes against humanity. And this is not ancient history. Much of the inequality that we live with today, the inequality of wealth, opportunity, political power, and privileged education, can be traced back directly to that extraordinary transfer of wealth from the public to the slave owners. A transfer funded by government debt that we've been paying off ever since, until just 5 years ago. Why did I never learn that at school? Or the other details of the brutal history of slavery and colonialism? And what can we do to improve the teaching of that history today? I know that there are different views about monuments and street names. Raised again by the removal of Edward Colston's statue, action taken by people deeply frustrated by the way their persistent efforts to achieve that had been blocked. This needn't be about tearing down history. It can be about placing history in the proper context. Perhaps the right context for Edward Colston's statue is the bottom of the docks that he used to carry out his lethal business. But in Glasgow, whether we choose to rename streets, or indeed the area we still euphemistically call the Merchant City, we could be instituting new memorials, lasting, visible, permanent structures to remind people of the history. This is not about tearing down or erasing history. This is about finally, truthfully telling history. Presiding Officer, I want to thank colleagues from the SNP and the Labour Party for an approach which has allowed us to unite on all of our positions, and thank the Presiding Officer for a solution that makes a technical change, not a substantive change, a technical change to ensure that all these positions can be supported, and I will be supporting the other two parties' positions tonight.
I welcome this debate, but it's actions that matter, not words. And thinking about this debate today, unless I feel uncomfortable saying the words and members feel uncomfortable hearing the words, we actually won't be telling it like it is. It shouldn't take events on the other side of the world for racism to be a mainstream issue in Scotland or the United Kingdom. George Floyd happened 2 weeks ago. Sheikh Ubayo happened 5 years ago. And we shouldn't think that this is an isolation. There is a global phenomenon where there are politicians who will seek to use nationalism and populism to other minorities in order to gain power. democratic power and economic power. And I also say to people, it's far too easy for us to think that this is about Donald Trump. Racism didn't start with Donald Trump. It won't end with Donald Trump. Trump is a symptom. He is not the cause. And I also say to people of all political parties and every member across this chamber, it's easy to take the knee and tweet and post about Black Lives Matter when it's trending on Twitter. It's easy to say the words when the whole world is talking about the issue, but it's actually what we do that matters. So to every single leader of every single political party, to every leader of every institution and every organisation, thank you for your solidarity. It matters, it's important, but we will fundamentally judge you on the action you take and the decisions you make. Because I know from my own experiences when speaking out, you get accused of playing the race card. The leadership of the Scottish Police Federation accused me of playing the race card. You get told that you're playing a game. People on my own side, and I say own side in inverted commas, briefing journalists saying it's a game, playing a game. People on my own side claiming that it was some kind of master plan. This isn't a game. This is life, and it's life for far too many of our fellow citizens in this country. So I say to every single member of every political party and every colleague in this chamber, if you base your condemnation or you base your solidarity on the politics or the perceived politics of the perpetrator or the victim, then you are part of the problem, not part of the solution. So question yourselves as well as question the wider issue. And I hope this is taken in the spirit that is intended. I welcome the government motion today, but I'm actually disappointed there's not more action in the government motion today, because it's actions that are going to make a difference, not just words. And let me share some examples. Every chief executive of every council and every government department, white. Every director of a department in Scotland, white. Every principal of a college or university in Scotland, white. Every head teacher in Scotland, white. Every chair of a public sector body in Scotland, white. Every High Court judge in Scotland, white. Every prison governor in Scotland, white. Every editor of a news organisation in Scotland, white. Why? Is it because we don't have the talent? Is it because we don't have the ability? Or is it because that the opportunity doesn't exist? Or worse yet, is it because people don't think they're wanted or they're not welcome? That's what we should be fundamentally addressing. And we talk about this Parliament chamber. In the entire history of Scotland, we have only elected 3 BME MPs to Westminster, 2 from one family. In this Parliament in 20 years, we have only ever elected 4 BME representatives, all 4 from Glasgow, all from a Pakistani background, and all Muslim. Not a single from a different gender or a different race. And quite often, to be blunt, it's been despite their political parties, not because of their political parties. So what I like to see in the motions from all political parties and the amendments from all political parties is actions. Actions on representation in all the institutions across our country. Action on education so we can teach our true history. Action on rebalancing our employment industry and our labour market. Because there are some things that are bigger than party politics. There are some things that are bigger than the yes or no question, or the leave or remain question, or the Labour versus SNP versus Tory question. And fighting for an equal society in terms of where no one is discriminated against because of their background is one of those fights. Silence is no longer an option. Colleagues, stop picking and choosing. There is no hierarchy of prejudice. And let's have actions, not words.